We will resume our program.
Let's go up. Oh, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, that's what we, all right, everyone. If you could take your seats, we're going to start our second panel. So everybody noticed, you know, your eyes are fine. The lights have been dimmed, okay? So it's easier to see the screen. I hope you have enough light to, you know, to take your notes and to look at what you want to look at on your table. But we'll try this, see how it goes, so it's easier to read the screen. So before I introduce the next panel, I wanted to point out to everyone here that an organization that the Canada-US Law Institute was one of the founders of is the Council of the Great Lakes Region. And they're having their Great Lakes Economic Forum June 26th to the 28th in Chicago. There are flyers. We encourage you all to attend. This organization is dedicated to the sustainability and economic development of the Great Lakes region, this wonderful binational resource of Canada and the United States. And if you look at the flyer, it's an outstanding program. So if you're interested in higher education in the Great Lakes, the elimination of plastic waste in the Great Lakes, the creation of a sustainable economy and a circular economy in the Great Lakes, as well as the integration of aviation, aerospace between the two countries, this is the conference to go to, and I encourage you to do so. Our next panel is going to look at the auto industry. And our moderator is Dr. Christopher Sands. He is the director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and he's a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And importantly, he's a member of our executive committee. Okay. Chris has focused on issues of Canada and the United States and North American integration. And he has done policy research and published studies for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Hudson Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Brookings Institution, the Center for the Study of the President's, the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, the Mitigation Policy Institute, and the National Endowment for Democracy. As I mentioned to you, he is a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and he focuses his research on international relations, and particularly the US and Canada. So Chris, floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Steve. And the only part of that you need to remember is I never turn down work. So it's a good habit. But one thing I particularly like is the North American auto industry. And for those of you who live in this region, the auto industry was doing supply chains before supply chains were cool. They understood the importance of linking manufacturing, whether it was vertically integrated back in the 20s and 30s to a much more horizontally integrated industry that we have today. It's really important to keep those relationships healthy. And that brings in a whole range of things. It brings in transportation, it brings in infrastructure, it brings in innovation, technology. But we're in a period of supply chain change. Supply chain change because we're thinking about reshoring, or as Diane Francis said this morning, friendshoring. But also we're thinking about much more data-driven, transparent supply chains as consumers and investors want to know, is there forced labor in the supply chain? Is there a carbon footprint in the supply chain? And this revolution, putting so much more stock in reliability, than just efficiency and just in time is changing the way we think about the industry and about how we get the goods that we have. And for my money, the auto industry was, is, and will remain on the forefront of this. And so I'm really pleased we have a panel to talk about how the North American auto industry is making it work. We have a tremendous group here, and I'll introduce them in the order they are for presentations, and then we'll welcome them in. I don't see them on the screen yet. Our first speaker is Ann Wilson. Ann is Senior Vice President, Government Affairs for the Motor Equipment Manufacturers Association, like me, a Washingtonian, or at least she lives there, which is great. Then we'll hear from Warren Ali, who is Senior Vice President for Innovation at the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association in Canada. Then we'll hear from my in-crowd, the great Sarah Goldfeder. And Sarah is Manager of Government Relations for GM Canada. But as Ambassador Cohen would have reason to know, she previously was Special Assistant to the U.S. Ambassador in Ottawa. And so she's American Foreign Service Officer by training and another American on panel, which is very nice. And somebody I've known for a long time, which is good. And then we'll be rounded out by Tim Goodman, who is a partner at Thompson & Hein, which many of you will know is Dan Utzo's firm. So, well, appreciate Dan helping us to find him. He's a former Chief Legal Officer for litigation at the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. And I mentioned that logistics infrastructure are also part of the picture. And I think Tim will help round out the panel very nicely. So with that, let me turn to Ann Wilson for our opening talk. Hello, Ann.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks everybody. I am going to share my screen, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. The screen is up? I see it, right? Correct. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person. We, as I was telling some folks before, are suffering some of the great resignation in the DC office, and I need to be here right now trying to deal with some of the many issues that are facing our industry members. But I am sorry not to be in Cleveland. I spent the 60s in Cleveland as a child, and until we moved to Northern Virginia, I had lived longer in Shaker Heights in Cleveland, Ohio than any place else in my life. So it's a shame I can't be there this year, but perhaps in the future I can. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about who we are. I would hope that many of you know who MEMA is, but you probably may not. We are a trade association. We represent manufacturers of motor vehicle components and parts. And we do this through our 4 divisions. We have a division for original equipment automotive, OESA, which is in Detroit. We have a division in our headquarters in Raleigh, North Carolina for automotive aftermarket. We also have a commercial vehicle division, and we have a remanufacturing division. And when we look at the whole issue of challenges in the supply chain, I think it's important to realize that suppliers, not the vehicle manufacturers, but suppliers alone, are the largest employer of manufacturing jobs in the United States. And one of the things that I keep trying to remind people and policy folks in Washington is oftentimes our tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers will be the largest employer in a county. It will be a family-owned, privately held company that's manufactured there, perhaps for generations, and is a real, bedrock for the community. And one of the things that is of grave concern to the entire industry, and I mean from the vehicle manufacturers throughout the entire industry, is the fragility of that part of the supply base. We all count on it. We count on it to be able to make vehicles in this country. We count on it for jobs in this country and economic well-being. And if you look at this particular chart, this is not just a Michigan, Ohio, Indiana issue. We go into Tennessee and Kentucky and other places in the Southeast, but our jobs are spread throughout the country. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to realize why our voice is so important and why I'm particularly glad to be here today. So when we look at supply chain concerns, one of the things I talk about it as is we have a convergence going on between supply chain, trade policy, human rights concerns, the issue of nearshoring and reshoring. All of these issues are converging together. But from our members' perspective, when we survey them, whether they're aftermarket, commercial vehicle, light vehicle, supply chain concerns are the number one public policy concern on their plate right now. And when we look at it, we divide it sort of into all kinds of categories. One is obviously the shortage of semiconductors. It's also the price and availability of steel and aluminum. It's the price and availability of other inputs, whether it's plastics, whether it's some of the materials that we have traditionally received from Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe. It's the ability of USMCA, and I'm sure my colleague Warren will talk a little bit more about this too, to work well for all of us, because without a strong North American supply base and operations, we are not going to be globally successful and globally competitive. It is the whole issue of China and Russia, the issue of ports, and then some SEC proposals that I'm going to talk about quickly. I'm going to try to go over these fairly quickly. Happy to answer any questions you might have. But as you look at this, you can really understand why supply chain concerns are so significant for our members, because it runs the gamut, folks. The first thing I wanted to talk about is probably the most important piece of legislation that is being considered right now in Washington, and it is the Competition Act. They are two different names. Those of you who watch Washington will understand. The Senate passed a bill last June. The House passed a bill earlier this year. They're both trying to deal with the whole issue of how does America become stronger in competition? How does America be able to compete specifically with regard to China? And how do we provide more R&D money, more money overall for our members or for our manufacturing so that we can be stronger as we look at the global competition overall? One of the things that is most important to us is in this legislation, both pieces, the House and the Senate, is $52 billion for manufacturing of semiconductors in the United States. Now, $2 billion of those dollars have been set aside for what's known as mature or legacy nodes, which are really important to the motor vehicle industry overall. When you think about nodes that are in your vehicles, think about, something in a seat or someplace like that. These are not necessarily the high-tech nodes that might be in your phone or in other operations, but they are very, very important to the operations of vehicles overall. The absence and the shortage of semiconductors is probably the one issue that when you talk to everybody that is impacting everyone. We have vehicles that cannot be completed. We have vehicle operations that are shut down for rolling different periods of times because of lack of semiconductors. And think about how this translates through the supply chain. That means if a vehicle operations shuts a line, if one of the OEMs can't get enough semiconductors to continue to do a line, then the tier ones, some of our bigger members, larger global players, will either slow down their lines or slow down their production or stop. But then you think about the tier twos and tier threes, and they only make money on volume. They've got to continue to operate. They've got to be ready to operate. But on the other hand, if they are not selling those components that are maybe it's stamped metal, maybe it's some kind of plastic extrusion, if they're not selling it to the tier ones who are not then selling it to the OEMs, they actually shut down overall. And what we see is then they're having a whole problem, which many of us are witnessing, of having employees come back to continue to operate. And we've actually had tier ones have to go in and bring their even professional staff into the tier twos and tier threes to continue to allow them to continue to operate once those manufacturing processes start back up. And I bring this up only with regard to, as you as lawyers look at some of the challenges your clients are facing, this sort of rolling sets of shutdowns is taking an immense toll on the entire industry. And it's being felt at the tier 2, tier 3 level. It's being felt all the way up through the OEMs. But that is one of the things the U.S. Competition Act will not, deal with the immediate issues, but longer term, it will allow the United States to be more self-sufficient. Not completely self-sufficient, but more self-sufficient and be able to compete overall. It also has some language in there that on IP protection. There is language in there about extending the Section 301 exclusion process for the China tariffs. There is also language in there that might include Ocean Shipping Reform Act and a continuation of R&D deductibility. So there's a very, very important piece of legislation which we really need to have passed in Congress by the July 4th recess. At the same time, as we start to look at sort of trade and supply chain convergences, then we really get into the impact that the tariffs that were put into place by President Trump really get on all of our members. First, there's the steel and aluminum tariffs. Now, as many of you know, with the agreement with the EU and Japan and with the agreement with the UK, there have been quotas placed on these tariffs or on these imports, and many of these tariffs will disappear for a time on many products. That's important, but quotas are very, very difficult for suppliers to work their way through. And it's very obvious that this administration does not have the intention of removing the steel and aluminum tariffs overall. So that's one part of it. The other piece is the whole issue of the China Section 301 tariffs. And these have been very distressing for our members. Many of them are aftermarket members because a lot of the parts that come in from China are aftermarket parts. But there are also inputs for further manufacturing in the United States. Some of these tariffs have been lifted in part, but the vast majority dealing with motor vehicle parts are still in place. And we're not naive. We understand China is a big political issue, and we understand it's a very hot potato, which we'll talk about in a minute. But on the other hand, we would like to see this administration expand that exclusion process. And one of the things I would tell you as sort of unsolicited legal advice, because in my infancy, it now seems like I did go to law school. If you've got clients who are talking about steel and aluminum prices and availability, or what's going on from China, you need to make sure that they're taking full advantage of whatever exclusion process there is. We understand from our members that the exclusion process in steel and aluminum is actually going a little bit better than it was before. And as again, there's a very narrow opportunity for exclusions in some of the 301 tariffs, but they really, really need to be taking advantage of it. I don't see the tariffs on Chinese goods going away anytime real soon. I think there's a lot of concern about our ability to compete as a country against China. And I think these tariffs are seen as a very powerful tool, although there is some talk now from the White House that maybe they don't need to be so widespread. So since we're on the issue of China, I do want to talk about something that is of grave concern to us. Last year, Congress passed legislation that would create a rebuttable presumption that any goods that come in whole or in part from the Xinjiang region of China was manufactured or mined with forced labor. And this really has to do with the forced labor crisis in that area with the Uyghur population. This was a bipartisan bill that was passed. It was quickly signed by the president, and it will be implemented as of June 21st of this year. Now, Department of Homeland Security has not released implementation regulations. We don't know how they're going to implement this. We don't know what forms this is going to look like. This will really hit the textile industry hardest first. However, there are motor vehicle goods and motor vehicle inputs that come from that region, and your clients need to be aware of these issues, need to make sure that they're on top of them, because again, it's a rebuttable presumption. It's not even transparency. These goods cannot come into the US unless you can meet that presumption and move forward. I think we are all very well aware of the restrictions on trade with Russia right now. We continue to make sure that our members are aware of the sanctions that are in place. We actually have not received a lot of questions about this. I'm sure many of them have sought your advice as outside counsel. I would tell you some of the more really heartwarming stories that we've seen overall have been the whole issue of how they help their how our members can help their Ukrainian employees or their families who are now refugees. And that's where our members have been spending a lot of their time and their efforts. I think when Chris mentioned sort of where we are going, also when we look at other larger issues, we have to include in this the SEC's proposal on how public companies are going to provide information on their climate portfolio, on their climate footprint. Our members overall recognize that they are already reporting a lot of this information either in the EU or through EPA. But again, this is a question of how this is going to translate through the whole supply base, because it's not just scope 1, which is what a manufacturer consumes themselves or what they purchase, which is scope 2, but eventually in 2024, the SEC wants to make this absolutely for reporting your supply base. And again, looking at the fragility of the supply base, this is a significant concern. Finally, no discussion of supply base would be final without discussing the slowdown in the ports on the West Coast particularly. This is a real problem for our members. The administration has done a good job trying to hook up better logistics, whether it be rail or trucking from these ports. But overall, these ports have not been able to meet the kind of needs that we've had in the post-COVID world. We are concerned because I think, as many of you probably know, negotiations for these West Coast port workers will begin this summer. They will begin the negotiations next month. But again, this is going to be a very difficult set of negotiations. We are also trying to pay a lot of attention to the authority and the pressure on the Federal Maritime Commission to address some of these issues in the near term. And I would just recommend to any of you who have members who have concerns about detention, demurrage charges, or overall any other things that have to do specifically with the ports, let us know. You can always reach out to us, or really try to use your contacts at FMC to make sure that you push that through. So Chris, I know that was a pretty quick around the globe kind of issues overall. Look forward to any questions, and I know I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. And you remind me when I was in school of the Peter Drucker line, that the auto industry is the industry of industries. There are so many industries that feed into it. It really is the heart and soul of the North American economy. Our next speaker is Warren Ali, who is, as I mentioned, Senior Vice President of Innovation at Auto Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada. Over to you, Warren.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody, for allowing me this opportunity to speak with you. I'm very appreciative of Anne's first presentation. You've covered off quite a bit of the issues and very articulate, but also your graphics pointed to a lot of the things that our members are looking at too. So quick background on the APMA, the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. We're a similar organization to ANDS and MEMA. We represent the OEM producers of the independent OEM producers of parts, products, technologies, and services here in Canada. So from the tier 1s on down, collectively that industry is roughly 100,000 skilled women and men and approximately $35 billion annually. Our larger members are ones that will be familiar with many of you: Magna, Martin Ray, Linamar, Woodbridge Group, ABC, and another collection of small and medium-sized manufacturers. Most of our manufacturing takes place here in Ontario, where we're home to 5 OEM final assembly facility groups. But the interesting thing about our members, and Anne spoke about this as well, the automotive industry in North America really only functions properly when all 3 countries' systems are integrated and working in harmony. And our members actually employ as many or more people in the United States and Mexico as they do here in Canada. And you are correct. We have quite a few members whose facilities in specific counties and districts are the #1 employer in that area. And this was something that came about and was discussed when we were negotiating the new USMCA CUSMA deal that came into effect in the middle of COVID, if you can believe it. So all of the issues and legislation that was being brought up by and in the United States has direct impact on quite a few of our members. We are also featuring a lot of those same supply chain issues that Ann had mentioned. The APMA has been around now for 70 years. And so we've grown and developed as the automotive industry across North America has too. And, you know, the interesting thing is a lot of those traditional supply chain problems, they exist, but people were able to navigate and understand ways in and around them. The whole semiconductor thing now, it's like, it's a problem unto itself. And it's a problem that is only going to increase, because as intelligence increases in the operation of the vehicle, so too does intelligence within those various parts within it. So semiconductors are only going to increase in importance, and they're also going to probably, for the time being, increase in number. So the supply chain problem is something that we're focusing on here in Canada as well. We're looking at assisting in growing the domestic supply base in order to be able to address some of these challenges. We have, interestingly enough, COVID gave us a line of sight as to how we do it. When COVID was first impacting North America, one of the main issues that we saw here in Canada, and I think in the United States as well, was the lack of access to things like PPE and ventilators and some of those critical things that kept the frontline workers, the frontline caregivers, able to do what they do best, but also in terms of keeping citizens and especially the workforce at our facilities able to function. And much like our counterparts at the OEM level in the United States, many of the APMA's members pivoted their production to be able to supply critical things like face shields, face masks, and ventilators too. And a lot of that production was not located here in North America before COVID. And so we had to figure our way through it. We had to figure out new supply chains. We had to figure out dealing with ports when we couldn't bring in those materials from primarily Asia. And then again, some of those more intelligent pieces like chips and everything else in order to make the ventilators and some of those products as well. So it gave us a window into how we can mobilize the North American supply chain to start addressing it, but it also brought to the surface some of those challenges in how are we going to access some of those critical materials and everything else that's going to be needed to bring it forward. These challenges we see are going to grow as electrification of both infrastructure and the vehicles themselves is going to increase. And so the critical minerals and metals that are going to be required to make batteries, those are things that the Canadian and regional governments here are also looking at addressing, because we have to make sure that, yeah, we know that there's stuff in the ground and we know what kinds of quantities and things we're going to need, but we also have to be able to scale up in order to ensure that we have that domestic supply chain in the event that we have offshore issues in sourcing it from those traditional places. So a lot of these things in looking forward as to what's going to make the automotive industry a success for the next 100 years, which isn't necessarily based on our success for the prior 100 years, is the activities and work that we're doing at the APMA, but also very closely, especially with Flavio and Anne, what we're doing with our friends and allies in the United States as well. Because these are things where there's no real precedence to say, how do you do it? There's no real things that you can look back on and say, okay, well, this is what we have to do because this is what we did before. And so this is one of those areas where getting smart people to start thinking about it, but also having the ability to be flexible in thought and understanding to say, well, we don't really have anything that we can plan or guide us. So we have to do stuff. We can't sit back and wait for it to happen. But as we're going forward, we have to be in some form of agreement to say, okay, let's try this and see if it's working, and let's put in all of the the markers and the guideposts to keep us in track. But if we see things aren't working, we have to be able to remain flexible in order to pivot and go. Because again, when you're looking at the front of your windshield, there's a vast area in front. We know we got to go in this direction, but we're not exactly sure of what that path is going to be. And we don't really have a great bearing from looking in our rearview mirror as to how we're going to find that pathway forward. So we appreciate opportunities like this to be able to share these things with the legal community, because there's a lot of great minds that are looking at other areas of challenges around the world that might be able to weigh in and feed into this discussion that will help frame some of the arguments and things that we're doing going forward, but also give us a sense of where we might be more successful if we were to try it. I don't have much more to add because Anne was very articulate in showing some of those things there, and I mimic and I repeat and I agree with all that. And so I will turn it over to Chris and the rest of our colleagues to hear from, and I look forward to having a dialogue with everybody today.
Well, thank you very much, Warren, and thanks for stepping in. As some of you know, we originally billed Flavio Volpe to give this presentation. He got stuck in Italy, and Warren stepped up, which that really counts for something. Thank you very much. It shows that the Canada-US Law Institute follows that very important principle, just in time or just in case. We always have a backup, and it's very good. Now I'm going to give you something very special as the audience, an in-person speaker. Your back of your neck might be feeling a little sore because you've been looking up, but now bring those eyes down to hear from Sarah Goldfeder from GM Canada. Sarah, over to you.
Sounds great. So I think, the previous speakers, and actually in the earlier panel as well, kind of honed in on this combination of factors that have really created a perfect storm for the supply chains, those being not just the renegotiation of the USMCA, but also the proliferation of other trade agreements that impact, all of our different arrangements, whether it be CPTPP or CETA, further negotiations within the EU. All of that is creating in some ways, a more restrictive trade environment. So we're really moving into an era of very much managed trade as opposed to free trade. And on top of all of that, you have the kind of the politics of made local. And I don't want to say made in the USA because that makes it sound like it's an America problem, and it's not just an America problem. I think what you see now is in every single jurisdiction there is a push for made local, and buy local, and really an understanding that it is important. The provenance of your goods and services is actually something that people are thinking about now more than ever. And on top of that, you have in the auto sector an incredible transformation. And I want to stop on that and talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's important to understand that car makers no longer just make cars. We make all sorts of things. We do all sorts of things. And one of the most lucrative forms for the future for us will be what we do, how we manage our data that we collect and that we use, whether that be, in order to work with municipalities and other jurisdictions on road maintenance and other infrastructure maintenance, or whether it is through services like OnStar and other apps that the automakers are now using as another avenue of income generation. On top of that, automakers are moving outside of the auto industry itself into things like financial services and insurance. And so I think it's important as we look at what the future holds for the automotive sector is defining their own future. And it's far more than just the cars that you see on the road. So in the middle of all of this, or towards the end, we have not just all of these other challenges, but also the pandemic, and now a war that is affecting the access to many of the critical raw materials that we use in our supply chain. So will supply chain pressures for the auto industry be lessened in the next few months? There's always the question, I think you see every single auto CEO gets asked, when is the semiconductor chip shortage going to end? I don't know that we have a great answer on that. And I think that what we really have is a real need to look on, what does the future hold for a supply chain that is increasingly stressed, and and I think, the government of Canada went through these consultations on this not too long ago and asked all industries, what do they see as the number one challenge in the supply chain? And every single industry without fail said people, the workforce. And I think that that is truly the solution on a lot of this, is it's all going to come down to people. And so when you look at how the auto sector has managed through this really challenging time on supply chain issues, it comes down to our people. So we have an entire team within every OEM that focuses on global purchasing and supply chain management. And they're not just looking at how do we buy what we need for today's today's vehicles that we're making. We're looking at what we need for the future. And so, Chris mentioned earlier, how the auto sector has gone from this vertical integration to, really being the industry of industries. And I say everything old is new again. And what you see right now is the automakers in a race to join, to start JVs, to start supply chain or supply, what's the word I'm looking for? Supply agreement. MOUs with many different suppliers and raw minerals companies as you look around the globe, so that they have a handle on what it is they're going to need and how they're going to get it as the future really kind of comes to pass in a far faster fashion than I think we thought it was. So when you look at the transformation into the electric vehicles, for example, what we've seen in the past on even the standing up of an auto factory has now been halved. The auto sector is making incredible investments, but not just the actual investment into the new facilities that we're going to need in order to make these vehicles, but there's also a level of speed at which everybody is doing it. And a lot of this is because governments are telling us we want our cars on our streets, we want our fleets to be electric. We want them to be zero emissions vehicles. And the automakers, Prime Minister Trudeau actually said the other day when he announced the budget, there's a ZEV mandate inside the budget that basically is mandating that automakers present a certain percentage of vehicles for sale as electric vehicles. So that's going to be a challenge, and it's going to be a challenge on a number of levels. And one of them, and the most key thing, is getting those vehicles into the dealerships with a whole slew of supply chain challenges that aren't going to go away. And the only way that we're going to be able to navigate through them is through the strength of our people and a combination of factors that really include the level of cooperation within North America. Just really quickly on Canada before I move on, I want to note, so being an American living in Canada, and I've lived there now for 10 years, one of the things that always strikes me is that there is a certain advantage to the asymmetrical relationship between the United States and Canada that is sometimes missed by Canadians. There is an advantage in being Canada and not the United States sometimes. And sometimes it's as simple as the exchange rate. Sometimes it is more complex, as that, there is, as Alex Panetta noted, we have an abundance of supply of raw materials and an abundance of supply of highly trained workforce. So that combination of things is something that's really strengthens the economy. So in many ways, I think leveraging the asymmetrical advantages of the relationship is something that Canada needs to be a little bit better at. And sometimes that means being more agile and having the ability to be more agile. It's a lot easier to move some things through the Canadian government. And then sometimes all of a sudden it becomes more difficult. We've talked a lot about critical minerals today and the critical mineral supply chain. And one of the challenges of Canada is a very strict regulatory environment, but it's also one of the advantages. How do you know when you're looking at your shareholders and you're trying to explain why your supply chain is certainly climate friendly, ethical, and quite frankly, the best it could possibly be on many levels? It is because Canada has a regulatory system that requires it. And that affects trade, And we're going to see that, I think, we see that in the United States legislation, we see it in Canadian legislation. There's going to be, a real demand for automakers and other industries to ensure that the goods and services going into their products are, not part of any sort of questionable labor practices, as well as having, a high value on the carbon footprint of what it is you're bringing in. So we'll see a localization of a lot of the processes. So just really quickly to conclude, I want to note, General Motors has in the last little while announced a lot of these partnerships that I alluded to before, joint ventures and supply arrangements with a number of companies on rare earth minerals, on rare earth elements, on processing, and we just had a really big announcement where, GM gets to be back in Quebec again. We'd left for a while, but now we're back. We're back with a CAM processing facility that's going to be built in Bécancour. And this is just one step along the way. This is a huge percentage of the actual battery component, and integrates the North American market in a special way when you have it being produced in Quebec, sent down to the United States for integration into vehicles that are then made either in the US or Canada.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Sarah. That was terrific. And, living in Washington, we often say a good man is hard to find, but we have gone to the Midwest to find Tim Goodman as our next presenter. Tim is with Thompson Hine. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Chris. So I guess I'm a little bit of both. I'm a native Ohioan, but I've been in Washington, D.C. for a good part of the last 25 years. But you can't take the Ohio out of the Ohioan. And I will tell you, having been in D.C. a long time, like you, Chris, these Ohio people, we all find each other. A teachable moment is just like me and my friend Dan Utso, who you all know. But in any event, thank you for your patience. I apologize I'm not able to join you in person. I'm an alumnus of this law school, and I have very, very fond memories of my time in this building, very fond memories of being in the Journal of International Law and working with people at the Institute and on the Canada-US Law Journal. Let me just also take a moment and say, I know that awards were given yesterday in the name of Henry King and Sidney Picker. And I would be remiss to take not 15 to 20 seconds and say the following. I never had Henry King for class, but several of my friends did. And to meet the man as I did was to live history and to meet someone who gave witness to history. And Sidney Picker was a fabulous human being and a fabulous professor. I had him for international law and some other courses. So it really just warmed my heart to see that yesterday, and wanted to make mention of that. One or two items just for context, for just a couple of stakes in the ground that I thought I'd offer today, and to build on what Anna said, what Warren has said, and what Sarah has outlined. So, I'm a partner at Thompson Hine. Our team is the automotive and mobility practice. So it's safety, compliance on the vehicle side, but also the customs work that Dan does, but also the emissions and mobile source regulation on EPA and the California Area Resources Board. I've been in private practice, but also for somewhere around a decade, I was at the U.S. Department of Transportation. And one of my jobs is I was the head of legal for enforcement litigation at NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So a number of these things, I'd like to say I've seen from both sides of the table. And if there's two sides of the table, having been trained in foreign relations, there's like 7 sides of the table. So go figure. But look, there's so many things to talk about, and there's so many great points that I won't further elucidate on that Ann and that Warren and that Sarah have outlined. But let me just give you a couple of stakes in the ground. The first is to think about the overlap between automotive regulatory in the United States and Canada and what we're seeing right now in terms of supply chain issues and otherwise. So, look, stating what has already been talked about, we're seeing this in everything from, chips to wire harnesses and other things. And it's going to probably, continue for a while. And one of the things that is just something that you're not seeing talked about at all in the literature and in the media, is that the safety regulation aspect from the United States and from Transport Canada has not changed. So in the United States, and the media botches this constantly, we do not have the government designing motor vehicles or motor vehicle equipment. It's never been the case that the government designs motor vehicles or motor vehicle equipment. That's something called type approval. In the United States, we have an version of that in transportation. And it's an agency that you've all heard of called the Federal Aviation Administration. And so the FAA, and this has been the law for time immemorial, before an aircraft manufacturer ever puts an aircraft into production, there is an office at the FAA that signs off on specs, designs, parts, components, everything before that plane ever goes into production and is allowed to be sold to an air carrier. We do not do that for automotive in this country. Instead, it is a system of self-certification, and self-certification to if there is a federal motor vehicle safety standard and other things that NHTSA regulates and Transport Canada regulates, which are known as safety-related defects. And so one of the overlapping challenges with the number of folks that we've been working with over the last 2 years or so is, what do you do in terms of self-certification decisions if you make a vehicle overseas, in Germany, in Korea, in Japan? And there are key components, chips, but other things that go into the manufacture of that motor vehicle. And the manufacturer in good faith has designed that vehicle to comply and knows it'll comply if the right component is installed, but it does not have the components to place into the vehicle before importation. Well, I know this will come as a severe shock, but the government sort of doesn't have rules about that, but there are guideposts. And so one of the things that has really been an exercise in, once again, using creativity and taking advantage of the laws that you have, is to be able to run those traps consistent with NHTSA law, Transport Canada law, customs law, and other things. Is there a way to bring the vehicle into the port and be able to marry up components at the port consistent with self-certification laws of Transport Canada, of NHTSA? And the answer is yes. So I just don't want to get too deep into this, but that's just one stake in the ground I wanted to offer to show the overlap between the regulatory safety and compliance approaches of NHTSA and Transport Canada and the supply chain challenges we're seeing. The second point I want to put a stake in the ground down is just to highlight experience of the last 2 years with folks that we work with in the industry, is the increased need to assure the bona fides of who you work with, suppliers, OEMs, or otherwise. And I'm talking about all of it: safety, quality, the safety culture of the people that you work with. I mean, and you deal with this all the time. I mean, and I know you've talked about this, but look, part of one of the challenges we're seeing from the regulatory standpoint with NHTSA, that is just another layer of complexity on the supply chain challenges, is NHTSA becoming increasingly skeptical of motor vehicle recalls across OEMs, motor vehicle manufacturers, that have common equipment that is the subject of a recall or other concern. And NHTSA's perception that this is the regulator's perception, that the issue is the equipment, and NHTSA's view and perception that perhaps the supplier should be doing more in terms of everything, in terms of further cooperation with the OEMs, further cooperation with the government, or perhaps even filing its own declaration of a defect or non-compliance with the government. So you need to go look no further than in the last 2 weeks, where NHTSA just opened up a pursuit. And a number of you are familiar with this, on LG batteries, and the challenge that certain LG batteries have been in Chevy Bolts, Hyundai Konas, Chrysler Pacificas, and NHTSA just opened an inquiry on this. I think that skeptics at NHTSA, you're going to see more of this. Now, this reality is this is where we find ourselves. And that it's not anything to be upset or emotional or afraid about. It's just that this is where we're at. And we know that this is another part of the complexities and challenges, and we run the traps in our industry. So that's the second point I wanted to highlight. And I guess like the last stake in the ground to put on all of this is to think about briefly the relationship between automotive logistics and automotive supply chains. So look, I don't count, but any piece of literature will tell you there's somewhere in or about 30,000 parts for a motor vehicle today that has an internal combustion engine. As the world turns, as our industry turns, and we go more towards electrification, you just heard Sarah talking about the ZEV mandate in Canada and the budget in Canada. That's going to go down in terms of components. What number? It doesn't matter, but it's going to be less than 1,000 perhaps someday. And so, I'm going to say this with a very tongue-in-cheek because it's actually terrifying for all of us in the industry. If you liked the semiconductor shortage, just wait. Welcome to cobalt and lithium. I mean, again, it's not anything to be upset or emotional or afraid of. You just know it's coming and it's happening now. And so, the shortage of cobalt and lithium and all of these related supply chains that are necessary for the electrification that the Biden administration has advocated for, and you see in current streams in the government, that you see in current streams in the government in Canada, this is going to test our existing automotive logistics and supply chains in ways that we didn't necessarily anticipate, not even maybe 5 years ago. And so that's a third point I wanted to make. So look, there's a lot of other things to talk about. Those are just three that show the overlap between the regulatory and compliance piece and supply chains in the automotive industry. I mean, there's a lot that's been discussed. There's a lot of things we could discuss today. Happy to, in terms of our folks, with folks we work with. Are people rethinking just-in-time supply chains? Sure. Are people rethinking lean? Sure. Are they going to go away? No, they're not. Are people thinking about broader sources? You bet. And but look, these are just a couple of currents, and look forward to continuing the discussion here on this panel.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Tim. And I think you'll all find as speakers, the best thing about KUSLI is that we have a great audience, both online and in person. And the questions you're going to get are going to be terrific. Before I subject you to those questions, this is a heads up to everybody. Have your questions ready. And if you're watching online, send them to us. I'm going to give everyone a chance to react to each other. There's a lot of overlap in these presentations, and in the order that they presented, maybe a chance to sort of reinforce a point or echo a point or add a nuance. Can I turn to you, Ann Wilson, first?
Oh, thanks, Chris. I mean, I do think it's important to realize that this is coming at a time of significant transformation in the industry. Automation, electrification, the demands, not just within our own countries, but globally. And it is estimated that with a fully electric fleet, the suppliers are going to lose 20 to 30% of the employment. So just as Tim was talking about, the different kinds of components that may not be necessary. So we have an industry that is trying to deal with supply chain concerns. At the same time, they're trying to invest in transformation. And this is very difficult for an industry to do and very difficult for a government to lead. I would just reiterate what Sarah said about employment. Workers are becoming more and more important for all of our manufacturers, and the workforce issues and the training and the retraining of and the upskilling of workforce is just a critical component of what we do every day.
Thank you very much. How about you, Warren Ali? Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, again, reiterating what Ann said, but also getting back to what Sarah talked about, both with people, but also what automotive companies now and what is considered a supplier. There's a technology transformation that's happening both in production as well as in the product. You'll find that if you look at the mission and vision statements of many automotive companies, they no longer purport to be a manufacturer, but some form of a technology company. And so again, how does this impact when all of a sudden software becomes a critical input? We've talked about safety a lot, but now, you know, most of things in automotive have always been around physical safety, safety of the occupant, safety of the workforce, absolutely, safety of the peoples and fellow road travelers as well. But now when you're getting into the idea about a technology company, then there's all kinds of other security that you have to talk about, and it's cybersecurity. And cybersecurity of, again, passengers and the occupants, cybersecurity when it comes to infrastructure. And so it becomes it's always been dynamic, but the level of dynamism and the level of complexity that's starting to happen in automotive and the various things that you have to start factoring in, you know, we have PIPEDA laws, we have all kinds of stuff going on with privacy acts, and, you know, the question of who owns the data now, you know, that becomes, these are conversations that there's definitely no clear answer. And, you know, Tim said about when there's two sides of the table, there's seven sides of the table. Well, all of a sudden now you got tables. There's not one table, you have tables and people at the tables. And now how all of a sudden do you start merging these conversations where there are going to be impacts in other areas and things that are going to impact you that you're not really have a line of sight to? So again, this is such an interesting time in the history. Automotive has been around for 100 years. And I said this before, and I'll say it again, the next 100 years of success in this sector are not going to be 100% defined or even, you know, based on where the previous 100 years has been. And so all of the skill sets, all of the different mindsets, all of the different types of legal expertise that's going to have to be in here to help set these frameworks in place, again, are going to be critical. And you're starting to define them now, and they haven't been defined. And the skill sets that we talked about, we're starting to identify them, but we got to remember, well, what's the education system look like in order to be able to prepare that skilled workforce? What is the training on the ground inside of the production plants that's going to allow it? What kind of cultures are we establishing when, you know, one of the things in Canada that we do really well, we do training and education, but we don't make a lot of people here. That's one thing. We make a lot of stuff. We don't make a lot of people. I am good. I've created 3 people of my own. So I've replaced my wife and myself, but most of the time it's one child and probably 7 dogs. So, you know, we have to figure out what kinds of cultures are we creating within these to be more welcoming of a newer workforce that hasn't necessarily been established yet or is in the forming of. So I love these types of conversations because there's no defined answer, and it allows me to bring in some of these other thoughts that we work on. But, you know, again, Anne, Sarah, and Tim, it's been a credit to be able to have opened the eyes from these different perspectives and be able to speak about it with our audience today.
Thank you, Warren. And thank you also for the reminder that although we believe in supply chain transparency, the supply chain of people creation, we probably don't need full transparency on. That gets us into a very scary area. Sarah, jump in.
One of the things that Tim brought up that I think really bears repeating is that, you know, this transformation to an electric vehicle supply chain means that there are fewer components in the vehicles themselves. And so what that means in the context of the USMCA for North American vehicles is that the value content, the regional value content of those fewer components becomes increasingly more important. And that's what you're really seeing, I think, when you look at all of the different investing in North America that all of the OEMs have taken on in the last little while. You know, there was some fear, I think, in Canada over the last year that the OEMs might be looking to downscale. But just in the last few months, Honda, Stellantis, General Motors have all announced significant new investments into Canada, and a lot of those have supply chain components inside of them. So, you know, Stellantis just announced a partnership with LG in Canada, and, you know, in addition to you know, some of these other pieces that I think you're going to see coming through in the next few years, these investments into how we extract, process, and prepare every piece of the raw material supply chain for batteries is going to be scrutinized at every level for regional value content, because we can't afford not to. We can't afford to make electric vehicles that don't comply with USMCA any more than we can afford to make ICE vehicles that don't comply with USMCA. So I think that those pieces, to me, are really critical as we look forward to the supply chain. And going back to kind of the, you know, the unknown unknowns on what the future brings, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's, you know, Tim mentioned cobalt and lithium. All of these things are things that the supply chain teams within all the OEMs are looking forward, are looking down the road at. And so I think we've been given a mandate by our leadership, by the leadership of our countries, that electric vehicles and zero emission vehicles will have to be part of the future. And the auto companies have all taken that on at full force, said, okay, we'll transition. This is going to take a lot of our own investment. We don't know how this is going to go. So governments, we're looking at you. How are you going to help us make sure that these vehicles get into the driveways in your countries? And I think that part's really critical. And that's why electric vehicle incentives are so critical on all measures, right? Whether it's a provincial jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction, or state jurisdiction, they matter, because they will ensure that the demand for the vehicles that are being made is met.
Absolutely. Now over to you, Tim Goodman.
You know, thanks, Chris. You know, Sarah, Warren, let me appreciate the context of what you just outlined, and let me build on the couple of things that you've just articulated. You know, one is we haven't really talked about, you know, the labor issues. I mean, we've all made a notice of it, but just anecdotally, I mean, Sarah, I know you have got to be intimately familiar with this challenge, and a number of folks that I work with. We can't get enough people, you know, qualified people in the plants. That's further exacerbating the supply chains. So you've got a supply chain disruption, then you have labor disruptions. And so, I mean, one OEM we work with, you know, forget trying to get, you know, it used to be really cute. Oh yeah, let's get the workers within 10 miles of, you know, geographic radius of the plant. Okay, how about 50 and that's not enough? How about 100 miles and that's not enough? How about go national, and that may not work for you either, because the turnover you have in the plant is, if you bring in, for every 2 or 3 people you may cycle in to work on the line, you may lose another 1 or 2 that very week. And so it's just a wash. And so that's real. That's a real challenge that's at ground zero of all the things that we're talking about in the automotive industry. And it's sort of like Back to the Future. I mean, growing up in Toledo, my dad being in the auto industry, you know, it was a very different time. There were very different issues, but the labor issues persist. And in terms of availability, in terms of training, in terms of longevity, in terms of worker satisfaction, and the investments you want to make in the human capital. So all of those things are just you know, it's another layer of complexity that is, on one hand, it's a real challenge, but on the same hand, it's such a great opportunity in terms of where we are going in terms of the industry and mobility generally. So I just wanted to highlight that for a moment.
Can I just speak to that really quickly, because it's really current for us at the moment. So we just reopened the Oshawa truck plant we being General Motors Canada just reopened the Oshawa truck plant after it was idle for about 1.5 years, and we had already released the workforce. And so when we went back to hire in Oshawa, we found that we had a labor force issue. And what we saw, and this goes directly to what Tim said, it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity. So what we did is we rethought how we were recruiting. And what we ended up with is a factory floor at Oshawa that is now 50% female. Unheard of in the auto sector before. But the reason that worked is that we were hiring for potential, not credentials. accepting that we were going to have to do training, accepting that we were going to have to spend some time and equity into these people that we were recruiting, and that we thought that they would turn around and give us that same level of respect back. And I think so far, so good. These are, we have a very excited workforce sitting in Oshawa right now. And I think you're going to see that across kind of across North America in the coming years, that companies realize that you have to think differently about how you're going to recruit and retain your workforce, because but what we did before isn't working anymore.
That's fantastic. And we always have a lot of students involved in these CUSLI conferences. And I have to say, with all of the fear of supply chain disruptions and so on, it can be actually kind of depressing, but there's a note of optimism here if you're entering the workforce. They need you. Jobs for people.
They need you, and they'll work to train you.
Even better. Let me now turn to Q&A with our audience, both online and in the room. Who wants to start us off? It's always the hardest one, the first one. Yes, we have a question there. Could you just say it into the microphone? I'm sorry to make you stand up, but that way they can hear you online.
Hi, my name's Heather Ferguson. I work for Ontario Power Generation. Really appreciated a lot of your comments, Sarah, and I'm maybe going to pick up on some different themes related to critical minerals, and hopefully won't repeat too many things that have already been talked about today. But I'm just on your last point there. That's fantastic about how you're approaching hiring and with females. I guess I just wondered also, are you considering diversity in any other ways, like a broader lens to that, or is it you're focusing on getting a 50-50 workforce of women and then branching out from there?
Well, I think the focus is on potential. And so it's not so much about what comes through the door. And I think what we see in the workforce of today and of the past is a very different makeup than what we're going to see in the future. And so accepting that you may be taking somebody on board in your facility that you're going to need to provide some skills to, I think is now where we all start. Because, for one thing, the technology is changing. And as we move into this transformation into electric vehicles, a lot of what we're going to be asking people to do has not been done before. So if you're starting from scratch, you have the ability to pull from whatever you've got in the community. And so it's not so much that we focused on a 50% ratio. We didn't. We focused on what came in the door. And what came in the door ended up looking very much like the community itself, which is what I think the overall goal should be when you're hiring, is that your hiring reflects your jurisdiction. And so we have signed on to the diversity challenge and the 50-30 challenge in the Canadian government as part of our agreement for the federal and Ontario funding that we received. And we announced this a couple of weeks ago now. And so we are looking at, really diversifying it. And one of the things that I'll say about GM Canada in particular is we are heavy users of the immigration system. And if you look at our facilities in Markham and Oshawa within the technical center, you will see a very broad representation. And a lot of that is because we can't find what we need in Canada. That's where we start. And more importantly, it's what we need in order to ensure that that we're able to continue to move our people around the world. We're a multinational company. We have facilities in virtually every continent. And so we need to be able to move our employees around the world through immigration systems that are friendly to worker-based and economic immigration. And Canada is a great example of that.
So Chris, if I could just add on to what Sarah was saying, we did a sort of a roundtable discussion of sort of worker needs, and obviously worker needs and worker training is a significant issue in the supplier industry too. But what we're also finding is, just as Sarah said, people looking at unique and differing ways to approach workers. We have lots of our members who are looking at people who might have previously been considered disabled to work, and they're not. Again, because like what Sarah's saying, the workforce itself and the workplace has changed. We have members who are using training programs in prisons and who are bringing people who come out of prisons who are willing and able to work very successfully too. So I think that what you're seeing here is the need for workers, the need in this transformative environment to train them with different skills. But I think this industry overall, from the supply base all the way through the OEMs, is doing exactly what Sarah said, hiring for the local community, trying to lean in and find different workers, and trying to make sure that the training's in place so that they can help be part of this transformative industry that's taking place right now.
Fantastic. Anyone else on the panel want to jump in? Just give me that. Oh, I can see you, Warren, please.
Yeah, if I could just add to that too. And so part of the thing that we've talked about is coordinating efforts with the other stakeholders, and that includes governments as well. And so, Sarah brought up some of the stuff that was put in place for funding and everything else, but we're working with the APMA is working directly with the province of Ontario on a few different initiatives. When it comes to training, we're working together to launch a digital learning platform that allows companies that might not have the internal bandwidth when it comes to both personnel and resources to develop their own training programs, but they know that it's important. And we're building curriculum for that, and we're building them a platform that they can then pull from that's based on content that would have come from some larger suppliers like a Magna or like a Linamar or Martin Rea, who have those types of resources at hand, but now they're allowing it to flow down to some of the more smaller and medium-sized manufacturers. But then when you're talking about the equity, diversity, and inclusion, there's a new program that we've done together in partnership with the government as well to help incentivize the expression and expansion of diversity across the automotive supply chain as well. And so there are different programs that we're working with that we understand and we recognize the need. Sarah did talk about the immigration programs that we have here in Canada and the ability to accelerate skilled workforce development. But I've had the pleasure now of being able to, attend both the announcement at Oshawa, but it also included the Bright Drop facility as well in Ingersoll. We've definitely worked with the team at the Technical Center Markham, which is not far from my house, but they brought in some pretty big rock stars in the software industry in some of the stuff. So, we can name names here, but, some of the people that we've had to work with there are, they are physical and visual expressions of exactly the thing that we're doing at the workforce level and the training side. And then the other issue is demonstrating that the actual production environment and culture has changed as well. So showing that there's, that there is a greater openness and opportunity for people of all types, sizes, shapes, colors to be able to function and thrive in this. And then it's expanding. Again, we can stick with GM, but they've signed an agreement with a company called Li-Cycle up here in Canada with regards to recycling the batteries. And so if you look at the membership and the makeup of the APMA's board, it's really reflecting on the various changes that are happening in automotive. We have Microsoft and Siemens. We have the Li-Cycles of the world. We have AI and machine learning companies that are represented on the board. We have LiDAR companies for connected and autonomous technologies. The supplier of old is not necessarily going to reflect the complete supply chain of the future. And by being able to show the workforce, the different legal communities, that we are embracing it and investing into these areas, it gives them a sense of, yeah, there's opportunity for us to work with and through these different groups.
Fantastic. And Tim Goodman, can I drag you in on this? I know you, like I grew up in Detroit, you grew up in Toledo. What's the role of universities as partners in training and recruiting people into manufacturing and into this very software-driven sector? Can you reflect a little bit on that? I think it's an area where, especially people here at Case Western, need to think a little bit about where to find workers, and are universities really doing their part?
Good question. Short answer. Probably not. How's that for candor? That's my perception, however. Look, and let me give you some data points about why that's my immediate reaction. So, Sarah, you know this probably much better than I do, but for by way of example and a tribute to the role of industry in terms of lifting people up and promoting them and training them has been General Motors over the years and other OEMs, but reaching out in the universities and getting young engineers and managers interested in our industry and getting them internships, and then setting it up in such a way so that when they graduate, they have a job. I mean, I work with somebody who started his career at General Motors in Detroit, going through that pipeline. And so I think that that is an opportunity that when I talk to younger people, God, that sounds terrifying that I'm using that phrase, younger people. Wow. I used to be one of those. And so when I talk to younger people, it's not clicking that those opportunities exist. You know, they think, oh, I'll go on LinkedIn. Sure you will. Because that's how people get their jobs. A lot of people do, but not necessarily. You know, there's lots of different ways to get to where you want to go. And, you know, Chris, to your point, I think the universities, this is a great opportunity to have traditional research universities, you know, like Case, like, you know, put your short list together, Carnegie Mellon, Hopkins, you know, and look at these things and think about what have we done that has worked? What has perhaps inadvertently gone into sabbatical? And what can we do to, in a perspective way, if we're thinking about that, one of, as we've all highlighted here in the last couple of minutes, one of the challenges is a labor disruption in addition to supply chain disruptions. What seeds can we plant now with the universities, with the industry, and create, you know, double down on our existing partnerships, think about new ones, things that we haven't considered before, so that we can plant the seeds for people graduating 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 10 years from now. That's a real opportunity there. And that's something that I think, you know, folks, yeah, we can feel as in the industry can be excited about, but also how people wanting to come into the industry to address these problems be excited about.
Fantastic. Now we go to another question. Do we have questions online? I was hoping for that.
I'll start with the first one here. The question is, in addition to the supply chain concerns for production inputs, what problems have the panelists seen in transporting finished vehicles to end users, particularly with roll-on, roll-off vessels for the export market? There's a second part to this question. Do they see these problems as largely driven by labor market dynamics, concerns with transportation infrastructure investment, or both?
Very good question. Who wants to field that one first?
I mean, what I would say about that right now is that the other supply chain concerns are making that less of a supply chain concern. That in, you know, what we have seen on logistics sides, and, you know, Anne went and talked some about what's going on at the ports, but I think, you know, overall, what we have seen on the logistics side has been, in many cases, the lesser of our concerns.
Anyone else want to jump in this? I know earlier this year we were concerned about CP Rail having a strike. We've had issues on West Coast ports. How are transportation logistics, notwithstanding issues of new infrastructure, how are they affecting this sector?
I mean, it may be obvious
Mark.
to some. It may be obvious to some. You know, it's a pretty well understood, you know, logistical challenges in terms of shipping things throughout North America. But some of the things that have exacerbated it are like things like fuel prices. So for sure, that's just challenge from logistics in terms of adding overall costs to everything. And I mean, everybody, I mean, I'm sure Sarah can tell you, the companies work on pretty thin margins. So when you're adding all these additional costs, and the only thing that we really saw here, and again, it was saying the same thing Sarah said, it's a small issue, but it was COVID when ports were shut down. And there was definitely issues with regards to cars just sitting in the ports that were being sent in or being sent around that just couldn't get off because of issues with health and wellness of the dock workers or the people at the ports and unloading those ships. So it had nothing to do just with health and safety versus anything more technical than that.
I would say too, that a lot of times the logistics issues that we have are symptoms of greater concerns, right? So the actual problem is the state of our infrastructure, for example. And, the actual problem is the issues that we're suffering with around climate change and the situation that we had in British Columbia, or what was that, last fall? Feels like yesterday. But all of those are symptoms of really what are underlying causes that are things that we just are going to have to figure out how to weather. And so I think what you see within, the individuals that, for me, I work closely with our logistics team within General Motors, and they are some of the most creative thinkers I have ever encountered. They don't take a problem and say, oh, that's a problem. They take a problem and find multiple solutions every single time, multiple solutions. And so every time we hit a problem once, the next time we hit the problem, we have whatever worked the time before, plus anything else that didn't work. And we just keep expounding on all of that. So I think, again, it comes down to people because there's so many differing factors around the world that are going to create supply chain logistics concerns and supply chain inputs concerns that you have to be able to work agilely and creatively.
Let me just add a couple things to what Sarah just said. And, Sarah, I'm so happy to hear you describe the way you just did in terms of people and problem solving. And I will tell you, I'll double down on my comments. I think that in terms of this law school, I would like to think that there were people that I was exposed to in this building that I'm only virtually with you today that, instilled in me source code that was the law is a tool. It is not a roadblock, and there's some of the great opportunities that present themselves are, coming up with options so that, and they all, and they run on a continuum, and some of the options, forgive me, are perhaps bad or suboptimal, but you've got options nonetheless. And so, kudos for thinking about creative problem solving in this space, right? The second point, just to highlight, is just thinking about this. The folks that we work with, OEMs that have been around 100 years to EV startups. Okay, it runs the gamut in terms of the logistics and where your components are coming from, stating what is brutally obvious. There's a difference between, look, we all know the Seaway just opened, end of March, so it's not even been open a full month, or it's just coming up on a month. But, several people we work with, for example, months ago told me, look, I got parts sitting and have been sitting for months at the Port of Savannah. I can't get them out because of trucking. And so why am I raising this? This highlights again the overlap between the logistics piece that Sarah is articulating and the supply chain piece of, and there's, not to turn this into a logistics discussion, but we all hear about all the time about, first mile, or some people call it global mile, middle mile, and last mile. And, part of what may be a long-term, I'm not going to say solution, a tool is to think about, what we're doing in terms of the middle mile, in terms of moving components from the destination port to the second port of distribution. We do that with trucking. We do that with rail. There's a number of things that you're seeing right now in the industry in terms of being able to, at least in part, address labor concerns and hours of service that you see on the FMCSA side, and in the industry side in terms of automation, in terms of, might you be able to automate this in terms of self-driving? This is not a self-driving discussion. That's a worthy discussion, but we're not going to do that today. But there's a number of other tools in the toolbox that short-term, not a lot of relief. Long-term, lots of seeds to plant that may give us other opportunities in terms of the logistics piece.
Thank you, Tim. We're now in the last mile of this particular conversation. And so in the interest of keeping to time, but also getting good questions in, we have two questions from the audience, one from Mike Robinson, one from Diane Francis. If I can ask you to both ask your questions, and then we'll take it home and give everyone a chance to respond to those questions so that we keep to time. Michael.
I'm Michael Robinson. Question for Sarah. where did all those workers who used to work at Oshawa, all the men, where did they go?
We worked really hard to find them other jobs. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but as we shut down that facility, I'm sorry, I jumped the queue. As we shut down that facility, we worked really hard to ensure that there was this dashboard set up to find people who were not at retirement age. A lot of them were at retirement age. And if you think about when Oshawa started up, it was about 30 years ago. So a lot of the employees were actually at retirement age and took retirement pensions and, took the check and left and are hopefully, I hope are all getting to play with grandbabies at this point. But the others, we really worked hard to find placements.
Well, I'm glad of that. And I hope they hadn't broken up with their spouses who then took over the jobs and they went off somewhere else.
There's a whole series online on GM Canada. You can find it on the Twitter account about the women that came to work in Oshawa. And some of their stories are just absolutely fantastic. Some of them are spouses of other GM employees, but some of them are second career. A lot of them are second career and they have great stories. I'd really encourage you all to look at that.
All right, so now we've even had supply chain disruption in panel questions, but over to you, Diane Francis. If you ask, I'll repeat, yes. So just for those who are online, if you didn't hear the question, Diane Francis asks about whether North America's moved in the direction of the Europeans with a one port, two country approval to facilitate movement within the supply chain, the logistics, and the flow. So now the question is, which one of you wants to take this on? Ann Wilson, that strikes me as a question right up your alley.
I think it would be very difficult for suppliers to do a one port type of issue. I think one of the things that's really good for us is to be able to bring, I can't even say it, the ability to bring parts in from Europe on the East Coast, the ability to bring them to the West Coast. And I wasn't going to join in the conversation on logistics, but that mid place for logistics is really becoming one of the really big problems of this overall. I do think, though, that one of the things we have to demand from the US perspective, and I won't speak for Warren, but we have to demand better coordination of the ports. We have to demand better coordination of computer systems within terminals. We have to demand better enforcement for the Federal Maritime Commission. They need more authority. They need more people. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. Besides the fact that we just don't have enough truck drivers in this country. So that's, another piece of it altogether. So there's critical pieces that we need to shore up and do better at. But on the other hand, I think we've got to have the ability, our members need the ability to bring in ports and components in different ways. Just look at what happened last week between Texas and Mexico. I mean, we've got to be able to retain the ability to move components across the Mexican border in real time. And any type of delay, however intended from a governor, just causes major disruptions in the ability for my members to be able to provide components to companies like GM.
Absolutely. Warren Ali, do you want to jump in? What's the Canadian view of that?
I wouldn't be able to add anything more than what Ann said there as well. So, I mean, this isn't something that's in my purview in terms of what I do, but I mean, we look at these things and these simple disruptions you talk about what the governor did in Texas, but we also had an issue up here in Canada not too long ago with I won't speak disparagingly of people, but people shut down the border for whatever reason. I like what Tim said when he talked about roadblocks and tools. It was in fact the legal community and the legal side of the automotive world that actually literally unblocked the road from Canada to the US across the Windsor the Windsor Bridge. It was the APMA that started an injunction that actually allowed and empowered law enforcement to go and remove the people that had indeed blocked the border. So had it not been for that, we had the province of Ontario, we had the city of Windsor and others that joined in, but it was the automotive legal community that actually started all of the activity. We mirrored some of the things that some young people did up in Ottawa in order to do that as well. But the people that were blocking it, it was the legal community that actually stepped in and actually empowered law enforcement to do its stuff. So again, we talked about the creative solutions that Sarah had mentioned. It's these kinds of things that you wouldn't think automotive people would be thinking about and doing, because you think they'd be focused mainly on $35 billion worth of parts manufactured a year and 100,000 skilled women and men. But some of the best and the brightest legal minds are working there. Some of the best and the brightest when it comes to government policy, rules, and regs development, they work there. Some of the best and the brightest when it comes to software technology investment decisions work there. So it really is a real interesting open playing field for people to succeed and grow in.
Sarah Goldfeder, can you talk about this a little bit from the brand name, from the GM top of the supply chain kind of picture? To what extent on one port, two country clearance or anything else, are you taking a role in coordinating some of the suppliers and or helping to form some industry unity in talking to policymakers about some of these challenges?
We do. We actually have, so our association is CVMA, so the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, led by Brian Kingston, who has been a huge asset in the about 2 years now, I think, that he's been with the association. And one of the committees that we have is the Customs and Border Committee, which works exactly on this issue, but also at the moment, a whole lot on CARM, which is something that only people that have to work border logistics would care about or or understand. But there is a lot happening on, you know, some of these issues that were part of the Beyond the Border initiative that we both remember quite fondly. Would love to see a little bit more action on that. And I think that there is a call for the automotive sector specifically because of how important it is to us that we continue to really, you know, put our shoulder into the issues of whether it's customs clearance, whether it's, you know, facilitating the transhipment of goods, which right now, I mean, my understanding is it comes into a port and then it's transshipped. It's not inspected by the Canadians. It goes directly to the US border and is inspected by the Americans. And so there's a lot of work still there, whether it's on the marine transportation, whether it's on roads or whether it's on rail. Our infrastructure is all in need of repair, of investment. And there's a lot of work to be done on that. And I think it's, you know, the auto sector ends up in the front of it because we touch every aspect of it.
And I'll second that on Brian Kingston. He is tremendous, and Goldie Hyder helped bring him up in the world. So thank you to our keynote speaker yesterday. Last word to you, Tim Goodman. How do you view these issues? And as somebody who used to be on the NHTSA side, you know, that role of government in keeping things moving or being a partner with industry.
So let me go to the last part of your question first, and maybe I'll end it there. There is a great opportunity to think of these things afresh. That's how I think that industry likes to approach these things. That I think that when you go back and you look over time, you know, look, these things are always in tension, like most things in life. And like most things in life, it's about striking the balance. From a regulatory standpoint, you know, there's a balance to be struck in terms of, you know, regulation that assures the public interest in terms of safety and other things, but also promotes innovation and promotes, you know, clearing out bottlenecks in terms of supply chains, if you can, and allowing the mechanisms of the industry to do their good work. It's not an and or type of a proposition. I think it's very much a both and type of a situation where, you know, from a government standpoint, one should be able to look at these things holistically in terms of not only promoting the public interest, but also ensuring that industry is able to innovate and employ people and continue to employ people and to do all these things that if we want to do this in terms of environmental protection, is going to need to be, with the industry, being partnered with that. So I think that I'm not sure if that's a vision, but it's a vision. And I think probably I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Tim Goodman, Sarah Goldfeder, Warren Ali, Ann Wilson, a fantastic panel. Thank you very, very much. And great audience too. Applause for yourselves. And now I'm going to turn it back over to C. Petrus, who's going to talk to us about what we do next.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thanks to you and your panel. Fantastic discussion. What we're going to do, we're going to take a short break. But before we do that, I do want to make a special shout out to our sponsors who have really made this possible. And I want to give you their names in recognition for what they've done. Our platinum sponsors, we have two: Cleveland Cliffs Inc. and DLA Piper. Gold sponsor, the Canadian Consulate of Detroit. Silver sponsors are Ontario Power Generation, Baker Hostetler, Cassidy Levy Kent, Suncor Energy, Dickinson Wright. Bronze sponsors, Quebec office in Chicago, Barrett America Inc., Pile Dynamics Inc., Formica Corporation, and Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister. And of course, our community sponsors, the Council of the Great Lakes Region, the Greater Cleveland International Lawyers Group, the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars and its Canada Institute. I think we should give them a big round of applause. So now we have lunch available for everyone. There are box lunches out there. What we'll do is we'll take a break. Everybody will grab their box lunch, and we'd like to start our luncheon speaking program at about 12:30. Okay, so see you back here then.